Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. I'm David Hoffman. I wrote a book that had a chapter about Project Sapphire, and that's how I know some of our guests, and I'll be the moderator. I want to thank Carnegie Endowment, the Embassy of Kazakhstan, and the Council on Strategic Risks for hosting this event. I really appreciate it, and it's my first time in this beautifully renovated Carnegie facility. This is the 30th anniversary of Project Sapphire. Hard for us to believe. It feels like we were just kids when I met Andy and began talking about this years ago. I'd just like to tell you that we are on the record. The event will be recorded. It will be posted later on Carnegie's YouTube site. And we will have a good amount of time for questions. I'm going to start off by introducing our panel. Then I'll have a very brief opening remarks, and then each of the panelists will. After that, we'll be open to your questions and the questions of people who are online also. And hopefully we can learn some things today. I really believe that Sapphire was an important moment, but you know now about everything having watched the video, so I'm going to emphasize lessons and looking forward and what can we draw from this experience for the world we live in today, which is radically different and more challenging. So our first panelist, Ambassador Yerzhan Ashikbayev, ambassador from Republic of Kazakhstan to the United States. He has held this position since 2021, and his extensive career includes service as Kazakhstan's deputy foreign minister, deputy head of the prime minister's office, head of foreign policy at the office of the president, head of the foreign minister's chancery. He's also served as Kazakhstan's diplomatic point person for matters relating to the United Nations and the Americas, and he's the lead communicator on the enhanced strategic partnership with the United States. Great to have you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you.
Our second panelist, Dr. Togzhan Kassenova,
Well done.
is the author of the award-winning book, Atomic Steppe. I must tell you, I endorsed this book on the back, and I said then and believe very strongly that this is a great story of the arms race going downhill. The arms race in reverse. It's one of the few times that we actually saw it, and I highly recommend this book. She's also senior fellow with the Project on International Security, Commerce, and Economic Statecraft at the Center for Policy Research at the University of Albany, a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where we are, and Dr. Kassenova served from 2011 to 2015 on the United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on disarmament matters. She's an expert on nuclear politics, WMD, non-proliferation, and financial crime prevention. And now, our third panelist, my friend, the Honorable Andy Weber, who currently is Senior Fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks. He previously served from 2009 to 2014 as Assistant Secretary of Defense for nuclear, chemical, and biological defense programs. He was instrumental in the non-Lugar cooperative threat reduction efforts to remove weapons-grade uranium from Kazakhstan and Georgia, and nuclear-capable MiG-29 aircraft from Moldova. He was also instrumental in working to ensure the destruction of Libyan and Syrian chemical weapons stockpiles. And I would say he's also done a whole lot of other things, which we can talk about later, but many of them are in my book, The Dead Hand, which is largely centered on work that Andy did in biological weapons, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, much of it in Kazakhstan, and it's a hell of a story. So just to begin, I'd like to say the video is very good at showing you the drama and the real significance of what happened at that moment in 1994 with Project Sapphire. That was truly a different time Many of the newly independent states were weak and they needed help. And I wrote in the dead hand that Senators Nunn and Lugar took a gamble with history with the Nunn-Lugar program. It was called cooperative threat reduction and helped these young new nations cope with an inheritance from hell. It was never going to be easy for these states to accept the hand of a rich and powerful America. And there were suspicions, delays, mistakes. But in the end, I think we can all agree, and I certainly agree with Senator Nunn, that the gamble paid off. You know, Project Sapphire was really just the beginning. I brought for you a monograph which I wrote for Harvard's Belfer Center some years ago about Degelin Mountain. It's called Plutonium Mountain, and it's on their website. But this particular story contained in this report covers 17 years of efforts to get fissile material out of Kazakhstan, way after Project Sapphire. So this is a long-running effort that Andy was personally involved in, and it shows that this was not simply a one-time thing that happened in Project Sapphire. It was actually the beginning of years and years from which I think we can learn. But the question I have for all of you today is this: how do we approach these kinds of risks at a time of great power rivalry and a new arms race, which I see coming? This is where we're heading. Would any of today's competitors be so daring and open as we saw in 1994? I mean, are we now consigned to a period of distrust and growing nuclear, chemical, and biological arsenals? If it was cooperative threat reduction, what are we going to do if there's no cooperation? I would love to hear some ideas. I'm worried about it, and I hope all of you can enlighten us about where we might go next. I guess the bottom line I have for you is, what in the story of Project Sapphire is reusable history? And what can we do with these new challenges? What solutions do you have in mind? So we'll start with the ambassador. Please,
thank you.
Your opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you, David. Good afternoon to everyone, including our online viewers. It's a great pleasure to be here today with such esteemed colleagues as Dr. Togzhan Kassenova and really good friend and partner of ours, Mr. Weber. And big thanks to Council on Strategic Risks for co-hosting this event, and thank you so much to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace for letting us into this quite cozy building. So today is a commemorative event, something that people usually don't expect. Some fireworks, right? It's a reflection on the past, taking stock on what has been achieved. And definitely it's a perfect moment to reflect on those bold choices made, which made a real difference back 30 years ago. And it would be also great if I'll try to do that, but I'll also ask my colleagues, co-panelists also to give a proper context, because some things today, they are viewed quite differently from the time those events took place. So it has already been said that Kazakhstan emerged as an independent nation back in 1991, and immediately we were the fourth largest nuclear power of the world. So, and well, from political viewpoint, I would say I would dream of those days when Kazakhstan was the focal point of US government's attention. Vice President visits, number of State Secretary of State visited several times a year as so many delegations. But at that critical moment, we definitely choose a path of cooperation and peace. And renouncing this nuclear arsenal was one of the most impactful decisions, not only by Kazakhstan, but by, I would say, any country in the world. And this example is especially relevant these days when we grapple with so many different challenges globally. And I would say, even though this was, as Andy mentioned in this video, we are yet probably to understand the true impact of this operation. But some experts have equaled it to the strategic decisions by, let's say, by Kazakhstan to join the non-proliferation treaty as non-nuclear weapon state. So that is the scale, the impact of this Operation Sapphire. I would say nothing less than that. And Project Sapphire was definitely a success on different levels. I would say success bilaterally with the US as it set the stage for so many success stories that followed. But it also showcased the world what could be achieved when countries work together with trust and shared goals. So this is a true example what trust can achieve. And we so often forget this critical ingredient, trust-building exercises. So this should not only be done in nuclear-related sphere or WMDs-related sphere, but elsewhere as well. So I mentioned several success stories. This was only one of the first examples of those success stories. Back in December 1993, Kazakhstan joined NPT as non-nuclear weapon state. We then also decommissioned the BN-350 reactor, which was actually producing weapon-grade plutonium. And we also, fast-forwarding, omitting so many other success stories, we also jointly set up international low-enriched uranium bank, IAEA's low-enriched uranium bank, right on the same spot where the Operation Sapphire took place in the northeastern city of Kazakhstan, in Semipalatinsk, at the plant called UMP, Ulba Metallurgical Plant. So beyond nuclear issues, of course, Kazakhstan being not only a powerhouse in terms of nukes, we also had considerable chemical and biological weapon stockpiles. So CTR framework was addressing not only nuclear threats, but all types of weapons of mass destruction threats. Today, 30 years later, Kazakhstan, under President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev's leadership, continues to advocate for international cooperation on security challenges. We've initiated UN Centenary Declaration for a nuclear-free world by 2045. I would say some of you, I see some smiles on your faces. The goal is seemingly unrealistic, but if we don't set the bar, if we don't keep reminding people of the danger, the modern-day warfare focus is shifting towards drones towards something much smaller and much more effective. But let me tell you, the nuclear weapons are still the most devastating and the most probably effective tool the mankind invented. So we are also advocating for the strengthening of global non-proliferation regime. And in this regard, I would love to stress the importance of P5's nuclear powers implementing their commitments. And in that vein, let me also stress the importance, the responsibilities rests with US Senate to complete the institutionalization of the Central Asian nuclear weapon-free zone. And we specifically request for the US Senate to ratify the Protocol on Nuclear Security Assurances to the CANWAS member states, which are all 5 Central Asian nations. And we believe this is a step in the right direction, which will not only increase stability and security in our part of the world, but globally. One of the positive ramifications of that step would also be an increased cooperation with, among those Central Asian countries. And I would also draw your attention to the recent referendum in Kazakhstan on the construction of a nuclear power plant. So imagine what an impact and what nuclear legacy Kazakhstan inherited, that only 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were politically able to bring this issue to a nationwide referendum. And previously, we're not a Swiss type of democracy when people vote for every single important issue, but previously referenda were held with regard to constitutional changes only. But this time around, Kazakhstan held a referendum on the construction of nuclear power plant, and which is signaling the importance and profound impact of this nuclear legacy and traumatic impact onto Kazakh society. So Kazakhstan, let me just wrap up by saying that Kazakhstan remains deeply, deeply committed to a future free of nuclear threats and stands ready to work with all the partners regionally, globally, to make sure that we'll have a safe and comfortable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Now, Dr. Kassenova,
Thank you, David.
opening remarks.
It's such a pleasure to be on this panel with all the famous people, especially Andy. Andy is very well known in Kazakhstan, and some of the readers of my book, including my wonderful editor of the Russian edition, they're in your fan club now. So I'll use my few minutes to focus on 3 points. And so the first one that I wanted to bring up is the value and the importance of nuclear material. So it was briefly referred to in the Netflix episode that if you have nuclear material, you've done most of the technological work needed to construct a nuclear device. And Kazakhstan had full control over tons of nuclear material. And I think it's very important to remember and appreciate enough the fact that for some reason, not for some reason, for its own strategic and political reasons, the government of Kazakhstan decided that it wasn't interested in a latent nuclear capability, right? Because if the decision would have been different, Kazakhstan had a very good starter pack. And I think it's important for today's environment as well to remind and remember that it was the decision And then from that followed transparency of Kazakhstan and reaching out to its main partners on Sapphire, on HEU. Kazakhstan actually communicated with Russia first, then the United States. So the transparency, I think, is also a very important element here, and the decision that you find 600 kilograms of highly enriched uranium and you decide that you actually don't need it on your territory. Not for now, not for the future. The second point I wanted to address is trust. And here it's both in terms of trust at the state level between Kazakhstan and the United States, but also the role of individuals and all the human interaction that made this cooperation possible. And I do want to bring up some of the names. Andy Weber, of course, of Project Sapphire and beyond. Bill Courtney, the first US ambassador to Kazakhstan, who was the ambassador during the time of the Project Sapphire. Jeffrey Starr, he was leading the Tiger team in DC. But also some names that we in our field maybe are less familiar with. For example, there was a woman, her name is Kim Savitt, and she worked to find funding and in-kind assistance for Project Sapphire. So she was literally on the phone talking with different agencies, talking to different companies, working through all this, the myriad of, what authorization do you have, what budget do you have, or if you're a medical company, what equipment are you happy to provide to Kazakhstan? On the Kazakhstan side, you had a glimpse of Vitaly Mate, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit about him. He was born in a small village in Kazakhstan near the border with Russia. He was trained and became a naval officer. So actually he had firsthand experience of working on a Soviet submarine. So he understood very well what that fuel was, because the HEU that was found at the facility, it was from a nuclear submarine project. And he was only in his early 40s when he became the director of that huge facility that was one of the key facilities for the Soviet nuclear program. And now, the Soviet Union collapses, complete crisis, salaries are not paid, production lines are almost, I think 80% of production lines were stopped because all the ties within the Soviet Union broke down. And so it's people like that, the fact that Andy and Mate went hunting, and that's how they were building trust. These are the important elements of cooperation like that. But also it's about just, what I call regular people, the technical experts on both sides, project managers, the technical experts from US national labs who flew there, from DOE or Pentagon people, and employees of ULBA plant. So for many Americans who participated in Project Sapphire, it was their first time to be abroad. And can you imagine your first trip and you are in the middle of Central Asia, you don't speak the language, you're in this very unusual environment. And for many employees, regular employees of the plant, it was similar. They never interacted with Americans. And I don't know, I'm just so touched by the relationships that were created. So the local ULBA employees would bring fish soup to Americans, uha, for the Russian speakers in the audience. And also they would share the pickled tomatoes and cucumbers, which was a staple in the Soviet families. And then they would tell Americans, but please return glass jars because, we need them back. And, and Americans would treat them to coffee and so on. And so I think it's a very important element. It's not only Kazakhstan, the United States, the government. It's also all these people at every level. And we should, I think, appreciate their role. But I also want to mention the trust at the state level. because behind this, Hollywood dazzle and, secret operation, nonstop flights and, secrecy and all of that, it was the trust, and I want to quote Ash Carter and Bill Perry, who marveled. They said it was, I quote, so they thought it was extraordinary that when Nazarbayev, and here it's a direct quote from them, Kazakhstan's former Communist Party boss and its first president after the Soviet Union disintegrated, discovered that there was a huge quantity of bomb-grade, highly enriched uranium on the territory of his new Central Asian state. He called the president of the United States half a world away and asked to have it taken away for safekeeping. And I think it's important, and I think it was Andy who said, we passed the audition with the Kazakhs, with the Project Sapphire. It's so important that it laid the foundation for decades of work under the cooperative threat reduction umbrella. So it kind of opened the doors for everything that followed. But I also want to note the entrepreneurial nature of all of this, both for Kazakhstan and the US. And the vision, for Kazakhstan, it was a young country, very few diplomats of its own, only building up, just starting to find its way on the world scene. And here it was negotiating with the world's major power. Similar for the US. The US never done anything like that before. So it took kind of guts and audacity on both sides to do something like that. And my final third point, I just want to kind of bring it to today and reflect, and that's in line with what the ambassador already said. So Ulber and just nuclear sector of Kazakhstan, early 90s, complete bankruptcy, everything is in crisis, so much that need to be taken care of, material to be secured, somehow you need to put all the facilities in good shape and so on. And fast forward to now, Kazakhstan is now one of the leading players on the commercial nuclear market. Ulber is doing extremely well, production of nuclear fuel pellets, powder, uranium, natural uranium, partners, in different parts of the world, and the sophistication of the products that Kazakhstan's nuclear sector can produce for peaceful purposes has been expanding. And so the fact that, from a facility, from the sector, from a country that needed so much help, it's now, now at the point that it could offer its services to host the IALU bank. That's also, it's a commitment, right? And for me, it's also part of the story of reclaiming the agency. So now it's not just, passively something happened during the Soviet period, being part of the Soviet nuclear program. Now it's also, that's our nuclear policy, Kazakhstan's nuclear policy. That's what we want to do. That's how we want to contribute. So I think it's just a very good story. And just for the, my final note, especially for the younger scholars in the audience, I want to bring your attention to the wonderful resources that the National Security Archive has, and we have representatives, Tom Blanton and Svetlana Savranskaya. They did a briefing book on Project Sapphire with original archival materials and some footage. So if you Google Project Sapphire National Security Archive, it will come up, and it's definitely a story that is worth studying further. And so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Andy,
thanks.
floor is yours.
Thanks, David. I'll just highlight 3 lessons for me. One is that when Kazakhstan made that strategic decision to forego nuclear weapons, and I had the honor of being there during Vice President Gore's visit, when the parliament approved Kazakhstan's entry into the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapons state. As a result of that, they're safe, secure, and prosperous. That's the key lesson that countries like Iran need to take away from this is that by making that decision, they made themselves safe and prosperous. Has anybody been to Kazakhstan in the last 10 years? It's unbelievable. I mean, it's changed so much since I was there in the early 90s. But it's because of that strategic decision, because of the leadership. First President Nazarbayev, at the time of Sapphire, current President Tokayev was foreign minister, was very supportive of these efforts. So it made a difference. So my second lesson is that individuals matter. Mm-hmm. People matter, leaders matter. Bill Perry and Ash Carter and Sam Nunn and Dick Lugar, they had a vision and guts to try something new, realizing that the stakes were high, and they created a prevention program, which was completely new for the Pentagon. And then the Department of Energy became intimately involved. And it's been a success. It continues today. The cooperative threat reduction is alive and well and thriving, in spite of efforts along the way by a few misinformed leaders to kill it. And we're doing work in many, many, many countries. I guess the second lesson, and this was mentioned by Ambassador Ashikbayev and Dr. Kassenova, is that trust is really important. And you can have trust between individuals. I developed that trust, for example, with Vitaly Mete on hunting trips and naked banya and drinking too much wild turkey together. But you can also have trust between nations. And that takes work. And it takes people at so many levels, at the technical level, at the junior diplomatic level, at the societal level, to build that trust and to maintain it. And we were able to do a lot of things because of the trust that developed between our countries, Ambassador, during Project Sapphire. And those are my takeaways. That's how we need to look forward for the next 30 years. We're in a dangerous place today, probably the most dangerous place in my lifetime. And I'm not young. I was much younger in the clip. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Thanks to all of you. I'm going to just kick off a brief discussion among us, and then we're going to throw it open for questions. And I find a note of optimism in all remarks of all three of you, but let me put it to you this way. We see in Ukraine people also who gave up their nuclear weapons at the same time. And it was a bit more of a struggle in Ukraine. It took longer, but ultimately they gave them up, and the Budapest Memorandum was signed. And now we hear from Ukraine, from people that we respect who are fighting for their democracy and the future of their sovereignty, saying, why did we do that? We shouldn't have done that. And I think that that resonates sometimes, and you hear it a lot. And I wondered if any of you could address this idea that we even heard it at the time in Kazakhstan and Ukraine, that nuclear weapons are valuable. We should keep them because they're worth something. It was overcome then, but it seems to be coming back now. And even in the case of North Korea, not a particularly rational regime, but we see years have gone by without any effort to slow down that nuclear program either. It looks like nuclear weapons sometimes in the possession of young and uncertain nations feels to them like a valuable asset. How would you address these Ukrainians, for example, who wish that they had their nuclear weapons today?
I can go first. So both Kazakhstan and Ukraine took the decision to give up Soviet nuclear weapons and what I would call latent capability. They did it for their strategic national political reasons, because it was a question of statehood. They were new countries that were about to enter the international community. Ukraine would be a different country if back then it would have decided to go against the international norms. We can talk about, whether these norms are fair, why we have nuclear haves or nuclear have-nots. But both in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, those norms were acknowledged, and the decisions were made that for the statehood, for sovereignty, that was the way to proceed. And I believe very strongly that it was the right decision, both for these countries, but also for the international security, for global security. And I think the question, I'm asked all the time whether Kazakhstan and Ukraine made a mistake and so on. I think even the premise of the question maybe is incorrect. The question should be, how did we find ourselves in the situation that Russia is going against the international law, against the political obligations under the Budapest Memorandum? But I just want to remind, people that they should look at history. They should also remember what it was like in the early 90s there, where these new countries stood and what kind of national identity they would have created for themselves if they made a different decision. And for Kazakhstan, 100%, it was a question of statehood, and it was a question of national identity, and I don't think there should be any regrets. And just briefly, you mentioned in passing that there were voices in Kazakhstan that maybe said weapons are valuable. There were such voices, but they were politically not very powerful, so it was quite centralized decision-making system. And also there were those voices mostly from nationalist-leaning movements, but they didn't have much political power. And noting the experience of Kazakhstan with the Soviet nuclear tests and everything, all the factors and all the strategic reasons were in favor of going the path without nuclear weapons. I do think that Ukraine and Kazakhstan are not acknowledged enough for the decision that they took back then.
And
Well,
I think it's an empty argument. People need to remember that had Ukraine tried to maintain nuclear weapons, they probably would have, even as weak as Russia was at the time, it probably would have caused a war at that time. But the other lesson, I guess, or point about your question is that individuals matter in a bad way too. And there's no reason Russia, unprovoked, has invaded Ukraine. It's a senseless war, 700,000 Russian casualties. Can you imagine? For what? So it's bad leadership. One individual, Putin. He didn't have to take Russia in this direction, but he's the youngest member of this Soviet Czechist generation. I think it's the last gasp of the Soviet Union, frankly. But to blame that on Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons just doesn't make any sense to me.
Do you have something you want to add?
yeah, let me just say that briefly. Nuclear weapons are not a magic pill that solves all your problems. It's not only the right, it's also a responsibility. So, and you have to, if you take a decision on that, we've seen many examples, right? P5 are not the only nuclear powers, realistically. So when you take those decisions, there are some responsibilities associated with that. And early in my introductory speech, I mentioned that we need to put so many things into the context. Something that is seen differently today had its completely different connotation. Of course, I cannot speak for Ukraine, but probably Chernobyl had its own impact, as much as Semipalatin's nuclear test site had a profound impact on the nation of Kazakhstan. I mentioned that only 30 years after this Project Sapphire, we were able to politically put the issue of constructing power plant, of developing civil nuclear capabilities to nationwide referendum. That is on the background of Kazakhstan being the biggest for consecutive 15 years, the biggest supply of natural uranium. We are the 43% of global natural uranium production. And we do have functioning nuclear reactors in our country, scientific reactors. We do have a facility producing nuclear fuel. We have almost every single ingredient. And yet, it's a very tough decision. But for Kazakhstan, we are signatory to a treaty on prohibition nuclear weapons. I wouldn't say that even here in the US, not everyone was pleased with that decision. If you look at the map of signatories and countries that ratified parties to TPNW, we are in isolation in the entire Eurasia. Not even neighbors of our neighbors are party to that treaty. That takes some courage. And this is whenever politicians, decision makers refer to a public support, in case of Kazakhstan, this is the nuclear, the weapons of mass destruction is the topic that we definitely have profound support of the entire nation. And even then, we have some voices advocating for, well, it would have been much better if we were to have nuclear weapons, but are they powerful? No. Because people, it's almost enshrined into our DNA, the traumatic past. Togzhan wrote a whole book dedicated to these feelings of Kazakh nation. Close to 500 nuclear tests were carried on our soil. This is not a joke. 120 plus atmospheric tests were carried out. This is not a theory. We have a first-hand experience. And this is, I promise to be brief, and as any diplomat, I went limited.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll pose one more question before we throw it open to all three of you. Again, I'm pushing back a little bit against this optimism. CTR was actually partially an organizational effort. You know, it involved state-to-state cooperation and organizations, and it was also very much the sea, right? When the issue of Sapphire came up, the phone call went to Yeltsin, and Yeltsin said, we don't need it, go ahead, take it. Over and over again in that time period, I recall, and you've all mentioned and documented that there was this great amount of cooperation, even things like Gor-Chernomyrdin, the bilateral cooperation. Now we seem to be in a different world where there's very little of it. We even worry about the nature of crisis communications between these great powers. There's clearly another arms race starting. Most of the arms control treaties that had set a precedent for cooperation are now defunct. Do you recommend, or do you see any models, or do you have any ideas for how do we deal with WMD threats in an age of arms racing and adversarial and not cooperative relationships? Should we be building anything? Should we be looking for other devices? What are they? I don't see them.
David. But see, you are kind of, I think you have a specific actor in mind, and your pessimism kind of stems from that, right? Because all the others, the other partners of CTR projects, for example, it didn't, it didn't collapse, or maybe the cooperation is smaller just because the needs are smaller. But all these issues are not applicable to, for example, Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan remains a good partner, right? There is a lot of engagement in the nuclear security field and so on. So just to kind of to note that. But in terms of whether there should be any new instruments or devices, and we chatted a little bit in advance about, were there mistakes in the CTI approach? So I would say that a lot of, CTI as a concept, I think, is a very good one. It works, and as Andy mentioned, it works in other countries as well. But if we are to learn from CTI experience and maybe learn from some of mistakes out of a very successful cooperation, I have just a few in mind. I think fundamentally all the restrictions that were there, especially in the beginning, Buy American or, pushing US equipment when, it was more expensive or sometimes didn't even work because it was too cold for it to work. Right. Sending, for example, junior managers to, Kazakhstan or to Russia and making senior nuclear scientists listen to somebody junior who would, I don't know, give a lecture on ABCs on nuclear security. That was kind of a little bit disrespectful. So it's all about nuance and respect. In Kazakhstan's case, I heard from the former officials that there was sometimes tension because the US can push a little bit too hard, right? Come in with its own objectives and priorities and maybe not take into consideration the objectives that the partner country has. So, there are those adjustments that could be done, but as an instrument, I think CTI is an amazing instrument. And we understood that you're a pessimist. I'm definitely an optimist. It won't be soon, but if we ever come to denuclearization of North Korea, it's exactly the CTI type of approach that can help. And maybe, not sending American specialists, but maybe sending, I don't know, Kazakh specialists, Russian specialists, and so on. So I think a lot of instruments already exist, and they just should be used properly.
Yeah. So I'm optimistic, David, but not naive. I said we're going through the most dangerous period in my lifetime, and I believe we are. But I think it's largely just a handful of countries that have brought us to this situation. Let's use biological weapons as an example. So we don't talk about it much, but Kazakhstan, one of the few countries in the world that, with technical support from the United States, destroyed a massive biological weapons factory in a place called Stepnogorsk, Kazakhstan. If you were to go there today, you'd just see a green field. Together, we built a public health laboratory, in a safe and secure public health laboratory in Almaty. And in spite of the Russian lies, it's serving the Kazakhstan people and the Central Asian region. Early next year in March, we'll celebrate 50 years of entry into force of the Biological Weapons Convention, which banned the development and stockpiling production of biological weapons. And it's amazing to me, as concerned as I am about countries like Russia, North Korea, that are flagrantly violating that treaty today, about 195 countries in the world aren't violating the treaty, are complying with the treaty, believe in that. So that makes me optimistic. The other thing that makes me optimistic is the new generation. I said Putin's the youngest of that old generation. And I believe that. And when I meet people who are under 30, in their 20s, it makes me optimistic. We have so many people who know so much more about the world, have traveled, have lived, studied in different countries. We didn't have that in 1992 when I volunteered to serve at U.S. Embassy Almaty in Kazakhstan. They had to teach me Russian. We didn't have people who had lived there, who, now we have 30 years of that. But I'm hopeful, and I think there are practical things we can do. Like, we need to call out Putin for threatening to use so-called tactical nuclear weapons. And the Council on Strategic Risks has done a lot of work on this. There is no place in this world for military use, so-called limited nuclear war, it's unacceptable. China doesn't have tactical nuclear weapons. The United States has very few of them in Europe. We need to not get back into that business that we barely survived in the 1970s, 1980s, when we had tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield in Europe, in NATO. We need to go against that and call it out. And the United States can take a leadership role by foregoing these types of nuclear weapons and moving towards a more stable deterrence, strategic deterrence, and not getting involved in these limited nuclear warfighting scenarios.
Indeed, but I think even beyond, I think there are limits to how much the US can promote non-proliferation if it itself doesn't show enough on the disarmament front. My day job is to promote non-proliferation and to help other countries with that. But I think this tension is growing, and TPNW is a sign of that, and the dynamic is changing. So I think there is a lot that what the US also should look at itself and its own nuclear strategy and policy, and kind of have a hard look at itself and understand its own limits in promoting non-proliferation while keeping nuclear weapons as the central part of its own national security.
David, if I may, my take on that would be, unfortunately, we keep seeing a simplified approach to so many issues. It's probably the characteristics of the modern day politics, be it on national level or internationally. It's much easier to go tough, to be straightforward, to demand something like my way or highway. But in fact, the problems are much more nuanced, and you can't simply resolve issues. Look, we've seen that in 1990s, the whole paradigm of thinking changed, right? The defense agency, which was all about fighting and somehow addressed this issue in a completely different way. And there is probably need to be a room for those types of, that type of thinking and those types of decision makers, including from the younger generation who, and I fully support Togzhan's point that we need to educate, we need to raise awareness of the younger generation, because all they heard is probably they know much more of drones, of modern day fightings, right, than of these devastating force of nuclear weapons, which is very much a theory for them, not something that they can practically see in the real life.
Great, thank you. I think now for the remainder of the time, I'd like to ask all of you to ask some questions, and we have a couple online too, but first, let's start here with
Thank you so much to the panelists. Great discussion. I know that Kazakhstan has played a really important role in a lot of arms control issues, including a large-scale on-site inspection exercise back in 2008, I think it was, for the CTBT. And now they're proposing also a big biological biosafety and biosecurity center as well. But, I'm wondering, you've all mentioned the very large element of trust, and I'm wondering how you can reestablish that when you have, in Geneva and elsewhere, the Russians are claiming, as you know, that these CTR labs or facilities have been turned into bioweapons facilities, and this is one of the reasons supposedly why they had to invade Ukraine. So I'm wondering how you can reestablish the trust, because it certainly doesn't exist when you see the states parties discussing things in Geneva. They can't establish something as easy and crucially necessary as a scientific and technical advisory body without politics getting in the way about Ukraine? Thanks.
So thank you for your question. It's really difficult. Tango is a dance for two, right? And trust cannot be built from one side only. You have to engage. For Kazakhstan, we definitely feel a responsibility, even though we are a small country compared to...
Middle, not small.
Well, we are embracing this idea of middle power. Definitely, we want to be a middle power, not only in terms of size, but also in terms of bridging gaps between those who have no trust in each other. And this was exactly the Geneva-based negotiations where Kazakhstan is proposing the International Agency for Biological Security. This is something that we as a nation which has a first-hand experience are offering, and it's an honest brokerage. We are trying, we've engaging all the partners to set up something that would address at least part of those challenges, of those threats. But unless there is a proper attitude and proper approaches from every single participant, those efforts will be a trust-building exercises. Whether we will be able to build trust in foreseeable future or not depends on everyone, not only on countries like Kazakhstan or some other like-minded nations.
Great, thank you.
So David won his another Pulitzer Prize last year, or was it this year?
This year.
Early this year, for his work that included writing about disinformation and the Russian biolab's lies, or the Russian lies about the laboratories in Tbilisi.
That's why I'm such a pessimist.
In Almaty.
We don't blame you.
But I think, and I've talked to very, very senior officials in Geneva, at the United Nations in New York, and they're getting tired of the Russian lies and the Russian propagandists like General Igor Kirillov with his 3 stars on his shoulder, who actually runs the Russian biological weapons program, talking about Ukraine public health laboratories as if they're a threat. It's outrageous, but I think most countries are just have had enough of it.
Well, I rest my case. I hope you're right.
Just to add on the labs, Kazakhstan actually is super transparent, and it offered, and I think countries took upon the offer, both Russia but also others, to visit the labs and to visit the lab and see that there are no secret basements.
Togzhan, not only to visit, but we also are free to any types of international partnerships using the facility, Central Reference Lab in Almaty, Kazakhstan. And that lab, by the way, just recently, that's return on investment was huge, since Kazakhstan was among very few countries that produced its own vaccine, COVID vaccine. So these are the benefits of being cooperative, engaging, and building that trust and partnerships.
Another.
Thank you. This was a great discussion, very interesting to listen. I'm curious, so you mentioned, the lesson is that countries will be safe and secure on the other side of a non-proliferation treaty, which is kind of an interesting development, I'd say. It seems as though Kazakhstan is more of the aberration rather than the norm. Ukraine and Georgia seem to be the norm of these states. And I know, this is getting into delicate territory, but how do we kind of address that reality in a straightforward way, I guess?
But so your question suggests that Georgia and Ukraine are insecure because they don't have nuclear weapons? Or is it also other factors that are at play?
I mean, even taking the nuclear weapons point to address it full, I mean, I don't necessarily think that Ukraine and Georgia should have kept nuclear weapons, but the other alternative seems to be insecurity. So how do we bridge that, even not directly discussing nuclear weapons, but how do we bridge that perception issue that there is insecurity on the other side of a non-proliferation agreement rather than security?
I think, obviously it's a conventional and accepted narrative that when countries feel insecure, they seek nuclear weapons, and that with nuclear weapons, you are secure, without them, you are insecure. Kazakhstan's case definitely proves, and I don't think we should look at it as an exception. We should take it as an important data point that questions the accepted narrative, right? Because where Kazakhstan would be in terms of being a state and being sovereign, it's a big, huge question mark if it would have made other decisions. But I also want to ask, fundamentally, in practical terms, are we feeling safer and secure right now in the moment of crisis, right? Russia's war against Ukraine, not because nuclear weapons exist and Russia has them, the US has them. Are they helping right now? Are they making anyone feel more secure, or is it the opposite, right? If not for Russia's nuclear blackmail and stuff, maybe the Washington would be faster in terms of providing assistance and so on. So just in practical terms, at least, if we take the current situation, I feel less secure because there are nuclear weapons. I don't feel more secure. Yeah, so that's where I stand. I don't know if you have other answers to this.
Oh boy, now we got a bunch. Svetlana, you'll go next, and then I'll catch everybody else.
Svetlana Savranskaya, National Security Archive. My question is about the new generation and how do we pass the lessons learned in the non-Lugar experience. Mr. Ambassador spoke about it very eloquently. I would like to ask a question and mention another way in which Kazakhstan is such an aberration, because in Kazakhstan, the memory, the narrative of non-Lugar is still very positive. Yeah. If you look at a Russian case, for example, we tried to organize a conference on non-Lugar in Russia, and the answer we got from very high up officials, they said, we're not going to dig into the story of forced disarmament, of a humiliating story of forced disarmament. So looking back, of course, Russia withdrew from the non-Lugar programs in 2013. And now the history of non-Lugar is kind of a black spot, one of the black spots of the 90s. In Ukraine, the narrative is also that, often we even heard that it was a collusion between the United States and Russia to force Ukraine to disarm. So tomorrow is the actual 30th anniversary of the Budapest Memorandum. Now, when we think about Budapest Memorandum, because of Russian aggression against Ukraine in 14 and then in 22, we immediately think about the failed security assurances. But if we think deeper, the Budapest Memorandum and negotiations about Ukraine joining the NPT as a non-nuclear state, that was huge success for Ukraine, for the United States, for the international community. How do you think we could transfer these lessons without this political reinterpretation of them, to teach the new generation, to be able to use these lessons in the future?
I think that's why we're here today. I mean, it's meetings like this that will be up on YouTube for people to watch for educational purposes, the Netflix series. We need to understand and share our experiences, and I think that's really important, the work that the National Security Archive does. But I remember a meeting we had that you organized in Astana, and General Maslin, a very senior Russian general, was extremely supportive because he knew what a difference Nunn-Lugar made for Russia. But unfortunately, there's the Putin narrative, which is just chock full of lies. There's his external disinformation and lies and his internal disinformation and lies. And what you just brought up is an example of his internal lies.
So,
Svetlana,
this, yeah,
Briefly,
if
we
I
have
may.
more questions.
Yeah, this is only part of the work. I never miss a chance to engage with students, and by the way, whoever from educational establishments, please do visit Kazakh embassy, and I would love to talk to even to high school students, because this is important. This is an investment into the future decision makers. But it's also, and this is probably partly a response to a previous question from gentlemen, this is history. We are shedding the light to what has happened. But the relevance of today would be to support the similar endeavors to reward those countries that been doing very positive things. Unfortunately, and this is equally visible both at national levels and internationally, the disruptors, right? The troublemakers are getting the entire attention. And speaking of those dates, this year marks 15 years since Semipalatin's treaty on a nuclear weapon-free zone in Central Asia entered into force back in 2009, and 10 years since the protocol on negative security assurances was signed. And it's still there. And it's low-hanging fruit. It costs almost nothing, but the benefits of the ratification are huge. Equally so, it has probably nothing to do with these WMD's discussion, but Kazakhstan is still under the Jackson-Vanik Amendment to the US trade law of 1974, which was introduced. That was one of the very early sanctions mechanisms which was introduced to punish Soviet Union for taxing Jewish immigration. 50 years later, we are again in 1924. That's the 50th anniversary of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. Kazakhstan is still being discriminated. We have a full support of major Jewish organizations here in the US. We have full support of US businesses. We are WTO member nation since 2015, yet something is not moving. And as Kazakh ambassador, I'm doing my part of the job. I have 43 co-sponsors now to a legislation in 118th Congress, and 43 is a magical number for me. That represents 10% of the House. And yet, it's less than a month for this 118th Congress before my carriage will turn out into a cabbage.
A pumpkin. A pumpkin.
A pumpkin,
All right.
yeah.
I have one online question I'd like to get in, and then we'll try to catch up with the others. I'm going to read the question, okay, for Andy. Could you describe the impact that Project Sapphire had on your career? In what ways did it inform or change how you viewed your position as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs?
That's a good question. It had tremendous impact on my career. I decided to spend the balance of my career until my retirement, and even post-retirement with the Council on Strategic Risks, working exclusively against the threat of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. And it was because of that experience, as well as my visit to the world's largest biological weapons factory in Stepnogorsk, that I did that. And having those experiences, especially the on-the-ground experiences, I wasn't somebody who spent my government life just writing policy papers or talking points for other people. I had a lot of on-the-ground experiences. I spoke Russian. I worked in many countries, and I think that helped me when I served for 5.5 years as Assistant Secretary of Defense.
Okay, there were a couple more hands up.
Thank you. I have two brief questions. One, I don't want to sound as a proliferation advocate, but in follow-up to the question that a gentleman earlier asked, and also in follow-up to Togzhan's comment about how come that we don't feel ourselves safer with in a situation like today. Nuclear weapons are. Everyone, I think, understands in the world that, well, we're not going to use it, so it is more a containment instrument. And if looking back, certainly it was a different country and a very difficult situation economically, and they couldn't maintain it by themselves. But looking back, it seems profoundly unfair that we took so many effort to disarm countries that are neighboring a massive nuclear power, right, like Russia. And so this is one. And the second one is about the Project Sapphire itself, because I back in mid-90s I was just finishing high school, but it feels like this operation was kept secret in Kazakhstan for quite a long time. I mean, it went in secrecy, but then in America we see that it was like, the information was disclosed almost instantly. In Kazakhstan, maybe I'm wrong, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like none of this news popped up in public discourse until the former president decided to run for the Nobel Prize. So why was it so?
I can take this question. Adil, so on the second question, it wasn't secret in Kazakhstan. Right after there was a press conference in Washington, D.C., the news also were transmitted in Kazakhstan pretty much simultaneously. It's just that Adil is from Kazakhstan, so he knows what he's talking about. It's just, I think, that we maybe in Kazakhstan didn't pay much attention to the, to education and raising awareness on projects like this, on their value. I think partly it was because, there was a lot of, personification, that everything was around Nazarbayev, and maybe because it was around Nazarbayev, the narrative was official and not going, to regular viewers or listeners. But it wasn't a secret. It's just that it wasn't maybe in so much in the public domain. But yeah, simultaneously, the information was available in Kazakhstan. There was a documentary from Khabar, and I think it just didn't become a part of the popular narrative. Unfortunately, I think, because this is a good story.
Well, let me add just that we had probably too many success stories on that front. Listen, the closure of the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site, the non-nuclear weapon status of Kazakhstan joining NPT, the moratorium that was basically initiated by Nevada CMA globally, and the entry into force of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and so on and so forth. So which one should be picked up as a signature event? And this one is one of many contributions by my nation into that global cause. So we should probably pay much more attention to a positive side of this story. We had nationwide discussions on advantages and disadvantages of nuclear power generation recently, and the legacy the history of nuclear weapons was reflected
Very much so.
very much during those discussions. So that's a traumatic experience. But let's shed light on the positive aspects of those contributions by Kazakhstan. There is nothing wrong with that.
And
All right, we're very short of time, if you don't mind.
no, it's just that there was a first question, and the assumption that nuclear weapons will never be used, and so just as an advertisement to the exceptional academic work by a French scholar, Benoît Pelopidas is here, Professor Pelopidas, and I highly recommend that some of his recent book, for example, talks about how it's mostly due to luck that nothing very bad happens. So it's not only about a decision to use nuclear weapons, they can also be something that wasn't planned, wasn't controlled, but it happened. And so, yeah, there is an assumption, but this assumption is actually too optimistic. Yeah.
Well, we got time. I think this will be the last question.
I'd like to thank the panel again very much, and Mr. Weber in particular. It occurs to me you may have some insight in this. I was privileged enough to actually have a chance to work in Almaty, more on the tail end, I guess, of Sapphire in the early 2000s, on some of the Oktau project. And I had a question coming in here because I went back, it's almost ancient history for me now, and read about that. And there was, in the literature I found, later shipments of HEU from Oktau, and they went to Russia. And so my question, I guess, particularly is, why was that shipment sent to Russia? And in light of the discussions here, it seems also worth mentioning that there has to have been multilateral talks there. So I'd be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, well, thank you for your contribution. This is another project that took 10 years that is not very well known. And I remember having discussions with the Minister of Energy, Vladimir Shkolnik, right after Sapphire about Oktau. In fact, I visited the facility a few months after Sapphire was publicly announced, by the way, by both countries with press conferences in Almaty and at the Pentagon here in Washington. So it wasn't secret. Once it was over, it was only secret during the operation to maintain operational security. But the Department of Energy, leading with the Kazakhstani counterparts, helped secure 3 tons of plutonium in spent fuel at the Oktau fast breeder reactor, the BN350 reactor. It was moved by rail across the country, and it's under IAEA monitoring in safe storage in eastern Kazakhstan today. So that's a huge success story. In very few small cases, material was returned to Russia. Part of it is just easier to move fresh fuel than spent fuel.
And Deglin Mountain was returned to Russia.
Deglin Mountain,
Also.
we also worked with Russia to remove and transport those most sensitive plutonium components by rail to Russia.
Well, our time's up. I know some of us could go on talking about this for a lot longer, but thank you all for coming. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to our hosts, Carnegie and CSR and the Embassy of Kazakhstan. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Togzhan, rahmet.